I still remember the day I first walked into Mrs. Johnson's classroom. I was 15 years old, lost and convinced that I was a failure. School had always been a struggle for me. No matter how hard I tried, the numbers on my tests were never enough, and I had started to believe that maybe I wasn't meant to succeed. My classmates were moving ahead, but I felt stuck, drowning in self-doubt. Mrs. Johnson was different from the other teachers. She had a warm smile and a kind voice, but more than that, she had a belief in her students that never wavered. On my first day in her class, she handed out a small piece of paper with a simple message written on it. You are capable of more than you think. I stuffed it into my backpack without a second glance, but looking back now, I realize that those words planted a tiny seed in my heart. Math had always been my biggest enemy. No matter how many times I tried to understand it, the numbers danced around the page, mocking me. I had given up, and most of my teachers had too. But Mrs. Johnson refused to do the same. She noticed how I would avoid eye contact during lessons, how I sat quietly at the back, hoping not to be noticed. One afternoon, after class, she called me over and said, I believe in you, and I'm not giving up on you, but you need to believe in yourself too. Her words were simple, yet they shook something deep inside me. Over the next few months, Mrs. Johnson put in extra time to help me. She stayed after school to go through the problems, step by step, using examples that related to my everyday life. She never got frustrated, never raised her voice, and most importantly, she never let me quit. Mistakes mean you're learning, she would say, whenever I got something wrong. The only real mistake is giving up. Slowly, I started to see changes. I was far from perfect, but I began to understand concepts that once seemed impossible. Mrs. Johnson celebrated every small success with me. I remember the first time I got a passing grade on a test. She smiled at me and said, "See, I told you you could do it." But it wasn't just math she helped me with. She taught me resilience, patience, and the power of hard work. She reminded me that everyone struggles, but with persistence, we can overcome even the biggest challenges. There were times I wanted to give up, times when the weight of self-doubt felt too heavy. But Mrs. Johnson's encouragement kept me going. She believed in me before I could believe in myself. By the end of the school year, I wasn't just passing math, I was thriving. I felt confident for the first time in years. As I walked across the stage on graduation day, I saw Mrs. Johnson smiling proudly from the audience. In that moment, I realized how much she had changed my life. Years passed, and I found myself in college, studying education. Inspired by Mrs. Johnson's unwavering belief in me, I decided to become a teacher. I wanted to be the kind of mentor she was to me to help students see their own potential. Fast forward a decade, and I found myself standing in front of a classroom full of students, just like she once did. One afternoon, I noticed a boy sitting quietly in the back, avoiding eye contact, much like I used to. His name was Jake, and he struggled with reading. He was convinced he would never be good enough. I handed him a piece of paper with the same words Mrs. Johnson once gave me. "You are capable of more than you think." And just like she had done for me, I stayed after school, working with him patiently, encouraging him with every step forward he took. Years later, Jake came back to visit me. He was in college, pursuing his dreams, and he told me, "You never gave up on me," and that changed everything. Tears welled in my eyes as I realized that Mrs. Johnson's kindness had not just changed my life, it had created a ripple effect that was touching lives beyond what she could have ever imagined. One day, I visited my old high school and found Mrs. Johnson, now retired but still full of the same warmth and kindness. I told her everything about my journey and about Jake. She smiled, her eyes shining with pride, and said, "That's the greatest reward of being a teacher, knowing you made a difference." Looking back, I realized that Mrs. Johnson was more than a teacher. She was a mentor, a guide, and a beacon of hope when I needed it most. And because of her, I learned that with patience, belief, and kindness, we can all make a difference in someone's life. As I left our conversation that day, I carried with me not just the lessons she taught me in math, but the deeper lessons of perseverance, hope, and the power of never giving up. And I made a promise to myself that I would continue to pass on those lessons to as many students as I could, just as she had done for me.